The young and the restless spoilers. Victor Newman had always prided himself on his instincts, his unerring ability to read people, to see through their deceptions, and to know exactly when something was off, especially when it involved any member of his own family. Over the past few weeks, the change in Nick's behavior had been subtle at first, a glance that lingered too long, a hesitation before answering a question, a casual excuse that didn't quite add up. But people make mistakes when they think no one is watching, and Victor had been watching. The realization first struck him late one evening, as he was going over projections for the next quarter in his private study. He noticed that Nick had left his phone unlocked on the desk in the adjacent sitting room, a careless lapse that both surprised and delighted Victor. He told himself it was a father's intuition, but in his gut he already knew something was very wrong. Leaning against the doorframe so that his presence would go unnoticed, Victor watched as Nick's thumb moved across the screen, opening a message thread that made his heart skip a beat. The sender's name flashed up immediately, Aristotle. A name he had come to recognize in recent days as the code word for the mysterious figure pulling strings behind the scenes. He suppressed a surge of rage. It was one thing to suspect Nick of disloyalty, but to see it spelled out in black and white. Aristotle calling himself father and Victor an outright enemy, that cut deeper than he cared to admit, even to himself. He read the message again. Father, I understand everything now. Victor never was truly mine. My allegiance is yours. The words felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. He had raised Nick to be a legacy, the perfect Newman heir, the unflinching loyal son. And yet here was Nick, placing himself under the banner of a man he had never met instead of standing by Victor's side. That single message raised so many questions. Why would Nick betray him? Why would his own son turn his back on him in favor of a phantom father? Victor's mind clicked through 100 possible explanations in a matter of seconds. Could Nick truly have believed that Victor was not his father? Had someone been planting seeds of doubt in Nick's mind, someone with the power to rewrite Nick's entire sense of identity? In their world, bloodlines were everything. A hidden paternity wasn't just scandalous, it was akin to treason. Victor felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. And it wasn't just Nick. If Aristotle was indeed Nick's true father, that meant an entire new legacy, a shadow remapping of loyalties, had been forged in secret. He leaned forward, heart pounding, and scrolled further down the message thread. There were times and dates, cryptic references to tasks completed, and hints that Nick had been receiving instructions. Victor's gaze flicked to the timeline. Nick had been communicating with Aristotle for weeks. The memory of that dinner a few nights ago, when Nick had excused himself to take a private phone call and returned pale and withdrawn, now took on new significance. At the time, Victor had shrugged it off as stress. Now he realized it was far more sinister. His son had become a mole. Worse, he had become a worshipper of a man who had likely orchestrated some of the worst blows against the Newman Empire. His anger flared. He would have stormed into Nick's office and demanded answers, but he forced himself to stay still, to steady his breathing. If he acted too quickly, too obviously, Nick would know he'd been discovered, and whatever plans Aristotle had set in motion could escalate before Victor had a chance to neutralize them. He needed to think strategically, for once allowing patience to temper the inferno burning inside him. He shut off Nick's phone, memorized the evidence he'd just seen, and quietly slipped back into his own study, where the dim lamplight revealed documents he already knew could help him piece together the larger puzzle. He needed to understand who Aristotle truly was, what he wanted, and how deep his roots were in Genoa City's soil. At that same moment, somewhere across town in his own secluded penthouse suite, Nick Newman sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, oblivious to Victor's intrusion. He stared at the ceiling, his heart hammering with excitement, fear, and a perverse sense of liberation. For years, he had lived in the imposing shadow of Victor's legacy, the unspoken demand that he conduct himself with impeccable decorum, that he perpetuate the Newman dynasty without question. Nick had tried. He had stumbled, he had failed, and each disappointment had only loosened his grip on the comfortable prison of his identity. When he was younger, Catherine Chancellor had whispered to him once that family was only as strong as the secrets you kept. He had nodded without understanding. Now he understood it all too well. Because the secret of his birth was like a loaded gun aimed at his chest, one that he would soon fire. He slid his finger across the text from Aristotle one more time, reading and rereading the words that changed everything. Your father abandoned you before you were born. I vowed to find you, to guide you, and to arm you with the truth. Victor was never your father. You belong to me. The words were grandiose, of course they were. Yet Nick couldn't deny the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. In that moment, he believed them. The idea that Victor had been lying to him his entire life, that the man he had called Dad was not his true father, felt like the clearest of revelations. Wherever Aristotle was, he had called Nick his son. To Nick, that was a bond forged in something stronger than blood, something primordial, irrefutable. He felt as if he were standing on a precipice, at the edge of a new world. And he would jump. Across the globe, in an undisclosed location. One of the opulent European offices that bore the Dumas name, Aristotle Dumas, looked at his phone screen and allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. It was late, and the flickering city lights of the coast illuminated his face in the darkness. His concentration broke only for a moment when he reread Nick's reply, I will do as you ask, Father. The Newmans will not see it coming. He leaned back in his chair, considering the enormity of what he had just orchestrated. It was one thing to secure power through numbers, through acquisitions, through backroom deals. It was quite another to sow a seed of betrayal within the most formidable dynasty in Genoa City. He had watched, patiently, as Nick grew under Victor's tutelage, always suspecting that the young man's bloodline was not purely of the Newman tree. Now that suspicion had expanded into certainty. And with that certainty, he had claimed a son to champion his cause. He recalled the clandestine meetings with Nick, face-to-face encounters where he had never revealed his identity fully, yet had given enough hints to keep the wheels turning in Nick's mind. He had slowly fed him fragments of evidence about a different mother, a hidden pregnancy, an adoption by the Newman patriarch when young Nick was just an infant. Aristotle had known how to manipulate emotions. He had studied Victor's weaknesses as carefully as he studied financial ledgers. He knew that Victor's single-minded focus on legacy had left gaps for resentment to fester, for suspicion to take root. And once Nick's trust in Victor began to tremble, Aristotle had pounced. Because nothing was more powerful than a son who believed he had been wronged by his father. Aristotle did not kid himself that this war would be easy. The Newmans had resources, armies of legal advisors, legions of loyalists. But he had something they lacked. The conviction of true fatherhood, a bond that went beyond the ledger lines and corporate boardroom etiquette. That bond could move mountains, toppling dynasties. Back in Genoa City, Victor paced the length of his study, the memory of Nick's phone still fresh in his mind. His first instinct had been fury, fiery words came to his tongue, yet he had forced himself to remain silent, to remain tactical. He needed proof. He needed context. Most of all, he needed to understand Aristotle's endgame. For if Aristotle truly believed that merely by declaring himself as Nick's father he could dismantle the Newman dynasty, then he was gravely mistaken. But if he had a larger plan, a network of allies ready to strike, then Victor's world was on the verge of collapse. He opened his secure files and began searching for any mention of Dumas's offshore holdings or shell companies bearing Nick's name. He needed to trace every pound he had ever sent, every letter or envelope Nick had received. He would comb through surveillance footage, search through Nick's appointments, and he had already instructed his most trusted advisor to freeze any suspicious transactions. He would starve Aristotle of resources, even as he tried to starve him of Nick's loyalty. Victor's face hardened as he thought of confrontation. When Nick had first proven to be an imperfect heir, Victor had tried to slip him into positions of increasing responsibility, influencing him to see the big picture. How to protect the brand, the name, the legacy. He had believed Nick was simply unpracticed, still forming his identity. Now he realized that belief had been his greatest mistake. Nick had never been the son he thought he was. A cold twist of fate that stung worse than any open betrayal. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the day Nick was born, the nurse handing him that tiny bundle. He had felt invincible in that moment, as if nothing could ever threaten his reign. How naive he must have been. But he would not be naive again. Outside Victor's mansion, the city hummed with normalcy. Yet under the facade of everyday life, a war had begun, one fought in messages, in shifting allegiances, in the quiet spaces where family and empire intersected. Nick, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose and belonging to Aristotle, would likely make his next move soon. Sabotaging a deal, revealing phantom evidence, executing the first move in a treason that could topple his father. Aristotle, exultant but wary, would have to ensure his grand reveal was timed perfectly, that public opinion was swayed and the legal advantage he craved was within reach. And Victor, in his study's dim light, planned every counterstrike with the precision of a general mobilizing his army. Because if this was truly a war fought with hearts and minds, he intended to win. No matter the stakes. But there was still one question gnawing at Victor's mind. Why had Aristotle waited so long to reveal himself? Had he been orchestrating this betrayal from the moment Nick was born, or had some recent event triggered the revelation? There had been a mysterious life insurance policy on Nick's mother, long forgotten until recently. There had been whispers of forged medical records. And there had been an unexplained payment into a European trust fund bearing Nick's name. Piecing these fragments together, Victor felt a chill. The timeline suggested that Aristotle's designs on Nick had been years in the making. A conspiracy so intricate and covert that even Victor's brilliant mind had missed it until now. He realized, as he settled back into his chair, that the immediate priority was confrontation. He needed Nick to face him, to feel the weight of the betrayal in person. But he also needed to keep this hidden from the Newmans at large until he had fully delineated the battlefield. Any public skirmish, any rash accusation, could tip Aristotle's hand prematurely, allowing him to vanish into the twilight of European influence before Victor could corner him. For now, Victor would have to play the waiting game, bide his time, let rumors swirl until the world believed Nick's allegiance lay firmly with his biological father. Then, at the precise moment, he would strike in such a way that Nick and Aristotle would both feel the full force of Victor Newman's wrath. Meanwhile, Nick sat in his bedroom, phone in hand, trembling with a combination of fear and exhilaration. He knew his next move had to be bold, something that would guarantee he could never go back to living in Victor's shadow. He had considered rewriting his will, siphoning off family assets to secret accounts, and sowing discord among the Abbott and Newman alliances. But he also knew that brute force might not be enough. He needed to lure Victor out, to draw him into a trap where Aristotle's influence could be cemented once and for all. The thought of his father frail and humbled filled him with an unholy sense of satisfaction. But the thought of betrayal, his own betrayal, lingered at the back of his mind, reminding him that once he crossed this line, he could never return. He slid open his laptop and began drafting a letter to Amanda, his half-sister, although Victor had never told him about her paternity either, detailing his new allegiance and inviting her to join him in forging a new family under Aristotle's banner. It was the first of many dominoes he would topple. As he typed, he felt a surge of righteous purpose. For years, he had lived as Victor's property, a darling in corporate photos and a pawn in philanthropic ceremonies. Now, he would reshape his destiny. If his mind wavered for a moment, he suppressed it, focusing instead on the image of Aristotle's face, the profound sense of belonging he had felt when the truth of his lineage was finally revealed. That bond would guide him now, even as he hurt the man who had raised him. Across the ocean, Aristotle read Nick's letter and allowed himself a small nod of approval. The next phase of his plan was clear. He would make his presence known in Genoa City, under the guise of philanthropy and investment, while quietly consolidating control over Nick's trust in the assets earmarked for him at birth. Soon, he would have enough leverage to force Victor's hand. And when Victor emerged from behind his corporate fortress to confront him, he would be ready. In Genoa City, as dawn broke over the skyline, the shifting tides of power began to reveal themselves to those who were paying attention. Nikki whispered concerns to Victoria about Nick's distant comportment at lunch. Jack sensed a tremor of unease when Victor casually cancelled their scheduled meeting, hooded eyes flashing with secret knowledge. Claire wondered why Kyle had been so distracted lately, wondering if the fallout from Victor's contract might be reaching a new breaking point. And Lauren, unknowingly carrying the shards of her imperiled marriage, sensed that something far more dangerous than corporate infighting was underway. Victor Newman, sitting alone in his study, allowed himself a brief moment of reflection before drawing a deep breath and standing. He would send for the legal team, call in the private investigators, and mobilize every asset he had at his disposal. But first, he would face his son one last time, in a conversation that would determine whether Nick Newman remained part of the family or became public enemy number one. Because in the ruthless game that was about to unfold, there was only one rule: trust no one. Not even your own blood. And in that moment, as Victor stepped into the hall, he knew the Newmans would never be the same. Because once the truth had been revealed, there was no going back. Victor Newman had faced betrayal before. Corporate mutinies, familial backstabs, enemies rising from the ashes of old grudges, but nothing felt as personal, as incomprehensible, as the moment he saw that message. Not on some rival's phone, not buried in a file leaked from a private investigator, no, it was right there on Nick's phone, in plain sight. Victor hadn't even meant to snoop. It had been a coincidence, or maybe fate. The phone was left unattended, unlocked, and the message thread had flashed up on screen: Aristotle. The words burned into Victor's mind like acid: "Father, I understand everything now. Victor was never truly mine. My allegiance is yours." He should have raged. Should have stormed down the hall, thrown open Nick's office door, and demanded an explanation. But he didn't. Not because the betrayal didn't hurt, it did, more than he would ever admit, but because something inside him whispered caution. What if this wasn't betrayal? What if this wasn't what it seemed? Nick had been off lately. Colder, more distant, strangely measured in their conversations, but that didn't automatically make him a traitor. And Nick was many things: defiant, idealistic, and infuriating at times, but stupid? No. Never. If Nick was calling Aristotle father, it wasn't because he believed it blindly. It had to mean something else. A deeper motive. A hidden agenda. A trap. Victor sat back in his chair, hands steepled under his chin, letting his mind spin through the possibilities. He had built his empire on instincts, and they were telling him two things. 1. Aristotle Dumas was more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and 2. Nick wasn't just a pawn. He might very well be playing a long game of his own. Which meant Victor couldn't afford to confront him, not yet. Not without proof. Not without clarity. Because if Victor was wrong, if Nick was truly trying to protect the family, to infiltrate whatever network Aristotle had built, then any premature confrontation would shatter that delicate operation. But if he was right, if Nick really had turned against him, then everything Victor had built was under threat, not just the company, not just the name, but the bloodline. Because if what Aristotle claimed was true, that he, not Victor, was Nick's biological father, then the entire Newman legacy was suddenly fractured at its core. Victor needed answers. And he needed them now. He ordered a full genetic inquiry, contacting his most trusted allies and instructing Michael Baldwin to quietly begin collecting records, birth certificates, hospital files, anything that might give them insight into Nick's true paternity. He wanted DNA. No assumptions. No rumors. Cold, undeniable science. At the same time, he ordered a discreet background check into Aristotle's personal history. Who had he been involved with 25, 30 years ago? Where had he traveled? Who had he paid off? What secrets had been buried under foreign aliases and offshore accounts? But while Victor dug into the past, he also paid closer attention to the present. To Nick. And Nick, clever, calm, measured Nick, was playing his part flawlessly. He still arrived to Newman Enterprises each morning, punctual and composed, participating in meetings, offering insights, even sharing dinner with the family as if nothing had changed. But Victor could see the difference now. The way Nick paused before answering. The way he carefully deflected questions. It wasn't arrogance. It was strategy. And that alone made Victor hesitate. Because now, he wasn't sure if Nick was the traitor or the trap. What if Nick was calling Aristotle father only as a means of gaining his trust? What if he was pretending to align himself with a man he suspected of targeting their family, in order to dismantle him from the inside? Could it be that Nick was the only one smart enough and bold enough to infiltrate Aristotle's circle without raising alarm? If so, then confronting him now would only blow the entire operation apart. It would expose him. Put him at risk. And if Aristotle was truly dangerous, it could cost Nick his life. But if Victor was wrong about that, if Nick really was siding with Dumas, then Victor's entire bloodline was at stake. Everything he had spent decades building could collapse. And still, that one detail haunted him, Nick calling Aristotle father. Was it just a manipulation? A tool to gain trust? Or was it real?